Hello everyone, my name is Jesse Himmelstein. I work at the Cree Game Lab in Paris, and I'm recording this video for you to help you think about games that you're going to be working on in your game jam on immigration in Korea. So I'm very jealous. I really wanted to be there. Originally, I was extremely excited about visiting South Korea, which I've never gone to, but because of budget limitations and other kind of constraints, we were unable to work it out. So Alexandra is there from the game lab, but I wanted to communicate a few other things that I've learned and a few ideas that I've had because I actually have thought about this a little bit, and I'm just hoping that maybe this could be helpful for you in some way. And if it isn't, too bad. Right now, my major project is called IncLudo, and it's something we're working on with India. We have a partner in India called ZMQ, who's a nonprofit that works a lot on kind of reaching out to rural areas in India, as well as working with companies within large cities like Delhi. And the goal of the project is to promote diversity in the workplace. So we created a whole bunch of games. We did this. This is a little on the lower left. There is a picture of with us kind of doing a game jam or a small type of game creation workshop with non-game creators in a company in Delhi. And on the right, you can see the screenshot from the first image is one of the games we made, which was an interactive novel. And as part of this, we've kind of created a lot of different prototypes. We've tested a lot of different things, and we've also done a decent amount of research on bias and stereotypes. So none of this is stuff that we created, but just reading everything that exists in social psychology and multicultural studies and stuff. There's lots. I mean, it's an extremely rich subject, and I've extracted a few little tidbits that I thought could be useful for you. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about. The other kind of source of inspiration is we actually had planned to, we'd applied for an EU research project with a bunch of really good game labs, including in Turkey, in Finland, in Switzerland, and EU projects were really hard to get. It didn't end up coming through. But as part of that, we actually did a amount of research, and we tried to distill some of that into a paper that was accepted into a conference in Berlin earlier this year, which you can totally read if you want. And also, we've been working with, at the Game Lab, we've been working with a group here called Game Impact that's focusing on creating games for positive social impact. And we've been working with them on trying to think about what kind of games we can make around this question about refugees and immigration. So that's sort of the other kind of source of inspiration. All right, so first thing, I just want to talk about a few kind of misconceptions that we found around refugees. So one is around economics. So there's quite a lot of people who tend to see, in general, people tend to see immigrants as a drain on society in one way or another. But in fact, when economists have studied this, they've found quite the opposite. So studies have found that immigration improves the wages for the unskilled workers in the host country. So here we're talking about host country. That's the country that's receiving immigration. So that's kind of a little bit counterintuitive. Like we always think, oh, if new immigrants come in and they're going to take the low-skilled jobs, and it's going to kick out people who have those low-skilled jobs. But if you look at it, at least on a more macro level across the economy, that's not the way it works. In the end, the economy ends up rising, probably because you're getting an influx of people who can provide their skills. It's actually a good thing for the economy. And what I find super interesting is that economists have found that the wages in the country that the immigrants are leaving also go up, which seems very strange. But it's also super interesting, and it might be that, in fact, in that case, the people leaving the country leave room in the jobs that they had taken. Maybe there's less jobs usually, and that leaves more place for the people who are in that country to take those jobs. So in fact, at least once again, in a macroeconomic sense, it's actually immigration is an extremely positive thing. And so I like this quote from Philippe Legrain. Many of the arguments that are framed in an economic way are actually xenophobic in origin. When migrants are working, they're accused of stealing our jobs, and when they're out of work, they're accused of sponging off welfare. When they're rich, they're accused of driving prices up, and when they're poor, they're accused of driving standards down. And to me, this sums up very nicely the way that people tend to think about immigration in terms of economics. And so just to make the point clear, that's not what economists have found. So there's another very common thing people talk about immigration in regards to crime. Because so more recently, I think Trump has been saying about how countries that have taken in immigrants in Europe have had these giant crime waves. Totally false. Um, in fact, it's when we try to look for like studies about this, it's actually pretty difficult because it turns out that a lot of crime statistics are kind of difficult to trust completely. Um, there tends to be very different police practices in different places. Different countries will, quantify crimes differently, will count them differently. There's different categories of crimes. Some crimes go underreported. Um, then there's all sorts of discrimination, both within the police and within the judicial system. So, it's well known that police will generally, patrol areas that have a lot of not necessarily immigrants in this case, but a lot of minority groups. So minority groups will get searched a lot more. They'll get stopped a lot more. They tend to get larger sentences, longer sentences. They tend to be underrepresented by lawyers, and so they end up in jail more. So again, this all kind of feeds back to the same statistics. So it makes it a little bit hard to report it. But when people study what they call crime victimization reports, which is basically like how do people report the crimes that happen to them. If you ask people, just ask random people, have you been the victim of a crime? And if so, write it down. In most cases, they don't find any real link between immigration and crime, rising crime. So again, another quote from a researcher, an increase in immigration does not affect crime victimization, but it is associated with an increase in the fear of crime, the latter being consistently and positively correlated with the natives' unfavorable attitude towards immigrants. So basically, the more people are scared of immigrants to begin with, the more they're going to see that link with crime. So, it's a pretty well-known phenomenon now that, for example, in the news media will tend to talk about crime when it's a minority group that attacked a majority group. That's the kind of crime that rises to the headlines, and the crimes that stay majority group attacking majority group tends not to rise, and minority group attacking minority group definitely does not rise to the top of the news, and so it doesn't enter people's kind of consciousness. Okay, and one last kind of point on the research, and something I found really interesting when I first started working on IncLudo, I kind of just thought of stereotypes as just a very kind of bland, kind of one-dimensional thing. You have a group, you don't know them very well, you don't trust them, you don't like them, kind of as simple as that. But in fact, in social psychology, they found some really interesting models of how stereotypes can actually be quite nuanced and a little complicated. You sometimes have to be careful about a stereotype that may seem positive, but may actually have very negative consequences. So these are called mixed stereotypes, and the thing here is from Susan Fiske in the early 2000s. And basically, the way I understand it is that stereotypes generally are about preserving one's place in society. So, I'm in this country, I've been, my parents, I was born here, my parents were born here, blah, 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 in the past. I have a place in society and it's mine. And other groups may threaten this place in society or not. Okay, and basically how I feel about other groups is basically about, are they a danger to me? And when we say threaten, it doesn't necessarily mean like physical threat, although it can be felt that way. But often more kind of like threaten, like you may lose your job, or you may lose status, or you may lose money, or something like that, or you may not be getting as far ahead, or maybe your kids won't get as far ahead in society as you would hope, something like that. And basically, Susan Fiske has split this up into two dimensions of the stereotypes. One is about warmth, which is about basically how much you think that they want to attack you. So do you think that this group of people is out to threaten your place in society or not? If you feel they are there to threaten you, they want to threaten you, then you'll feel cold for them or less warm. If you feel they don't, then you feel warm toward them. And competence is basically the flip side. It's the ability. Like, okay, regardless of whether or not they want to harm your place in society, could they if they wanted to? Basically, how good are they? How competitive are they? So this little chart here can be a little hard to read, but basically there's a grid of 2 by 2. So warmth versus competence. So let's start maybe in the upper left there. So groups that are high in warmth and low in competence. Means that high in warmth means they don't feel, you don't feel that they want to threaten you. And yeah, you don't feel they want to threaten you, and also they couldn't really do it if they wanted to. And this kind of lends this kind of paternalistic thing. So the examples they give, this is an American society in the early 2000s, so this may not cross all cultural boundaries, but basically like elderly people, people who are disabled, and housewives, so stay-at-home women, that are kind of seen as like you kind of have pity towards them. Basically, the majority group feels pity, like they're kind of like they need to be taken care of. They're not very they're not very threatening. Neither are they really very good. They can't really threaten your place in society if they wanted to. So it leads kind of this feeling of pity. So pity is not in itself necessarily as bad as like hatred, as you might, right? So like, but it's not a very positive feeling for them either, right? You're not, if you feel pity towards a group, you're not going to help them kind of like realize their dreams and do everything they can do. You're going to kind of feel like, oh, they should be kind of taken care of and kind of put out of the way, which is not in the end a positive stereotype, even though it's not outright, we should kill them all. All right, maybe on the other side, so the lower right, we have low warmth and high competence. So this kind of lends to like an envious type of prejudice. So the examples given in this paper were Asians, Jews, rich people, and feminists. So basically, people who are seen as they're kind of threatening. They do kind of threaten to harm you, and they could actually do it if they wanted to. They're kind of they're outspoken. They're successful in society. So these are groups that are kind of wary of. You might be kind of envious of. Like you kind of wish you were good as them. So again, not totally like hatred type of feeling, but at the same time, yeah, these are not positive stereotypes either. Right? You may think that all they care about is competition or something like that. Or you may feel like you can't get along with them, or that if they weren't there, it would make your life easier. And on the lower left is basically what they call the lowest of the low. So it's feelings that are basically groups that are seen as they could threaten you if they wanted to. They would if they could, but they can't. And this leads to a feeling of contempt, of disgust, resentment. So the examples, again, in this American context are welfare recipients, so people getting a lot of money from the state, and a lot. Viewed from this point of view, people would see them as getting too much money from the state, and poor people in general, basically kind of like leeching on the society, and that's often the way it's seen, at least in America. And so this kind of, and it's actually really interesting. Susan Fisk did some follow-up studies on this with brain imaging, where she studied the way that the kind of areas that the brain that light up when people are in certain situations. And so she actually found that there's parts of the brain that tend to light up when we're in social situations with greeting somebody else, and there's parts of the brain that light up when you're kind of manipulating objects and stuff like that, like you see whatever, something like a table you need to move or something like that. And she found that in this group of the lowest of the low, like maybe like someone begging on the street or something like that, people will tend to actually activate the part of the brain that deals with objects and not the part of the brain that deals with people, which implies that our brains may literally treat other people as objects in a very literal sense, at least in our brains. And this is not necessarily something that people control on, but it is the way that our brain psychology could work, which is quite scary. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about integration. So people kind of throw around words like integration, but it's not always clear what exactly they mean. When we looked into this, we found that the notion of integration is something, it's kind of this middle ground that people are trying to reach. Also sometimes called inclusion, tends to be kind of a similar term. And the key of this is neither alienation nor assimilation. So alienation is basically like this group should be like kept out, they should be out, they're alien to us. And assimilation is like this group should be assimilated into like the Borg of our society. And often I think people think about, people in a host country will think about immigrants in an assimilation way. Like, oh, they can come here as long as they, learn our language, act the way we do, eat as we do, dress the way we do, basically do everything the way we do it. Then it's okay. But, so that's called like assimilation. But what's important to understand in assimilation is that they're losing their culture in the process, and in integration, there's something that is it's kind of this middle ground where the immigrants who come in keep their cultural identity, but also adapt to the society. And this is very key, the society also has to adapt. The host country society does have to adapt. So it's a real two-way process. So I'll just use this quote. From a refugee perspective, integration requires a preparedness to adapt to the lifestyle of the host society without having to lose one's cultural identity. From the point of view of the host society, it requires a willingness to adapt public institutions to changes in the population profile, accept refugees as part of the national community, and take action to facilitate access to resources and decision-making process. And this is also super important. And to us, when we were writing this refugee project that I talked about earlier, this really seems to be a key aspect. There's not, because usually when we frame the refugee debate, it tends to be around, there are people who are being pursued and literally being killed. They need to be taken in somewhere. We need to be taken care of. They need to be protected from harm. And then a lot of, which is totally true. And then there's a lot of this kind of ends there. Like a lot of, when we talk about immigration, kind of ends at that point. Like they're in the country, okay, it's good. But it's not good, right? I mean, there's a lot more to do. You have people from a very different society. They're coming in. Is the society reaching out to them? Is it integrating them in some way? Or are they just kind of being left on their own to try to pick up the pieces when they don't necessarily know the language, the culture, everything else? It's very difficult to integrate in society. It's not something that happens like that. And yeah, so the best example that I've found, at least in France, of how people deal with this is a group called Singa. So they were part of that project too. So they're based in Paris now. I think they're in other countries as well. All out. I think they believe they started with this project called Calm, which is comme à la maison. So it's like at home. And basically the idea is that you go to a website if you have a free room or a free bed that you can offer a refugee and say, I'm happy to take a refugee in my home. And so people go on there, they offer their beds, and then they basically make the connection with refugees who need a place to sleep. And they come there. And what's really nice is that it starts creating this social link. So yes, for one thing, you're doing a very concrete thing of giving a bed to somebody who really needs it. But in addition to that, there's this, you're starting to make these links in between host population and refugees. And they kind of taken this philosophy and they pushed it much farther, seeing a refugee basically as an asset. When they talk about refugees, it's in a very different way. It's not in this way like they're a burden on society, nor are they these aliens that are coming in, nor do we have pity on them, like we just need to protect them in a paternalistic way. It's not that. They really see them as people they really see them as opportunities. Like refugees are people who have a lot to offer us. And how can we, make the most of this opportunity that we have? Which I find a very powerful way of thinking about it. So they organize events and workshops where they're trying to get people from the different societies involved. They do things around music and culture and sports. They help refugees start companies, find jobs, and once again, it's sort of all this idea of trying to make the most of this opportunity, trying to give refugees the best chance they can by integrating them, but also let the host population understand what a powerful resource that refugees can be. So just to bring it back to games, most of the games don't get to this integration aspect, which I think is a shame. Usually the approach taken is to put someone, it's kind of, the idea is to create an empathy for the refugee. So you basically put the player in the place of the refugee and you kind of have like a refugee journey type of story. So we see this quite a bit. So, I mean, quite a bit. Among the few games that deal with refugees, this tends to be the dominant thing. So so players are put in the position of a refugee who are forced to flee somewhere, and then they'll travel, and often the travel is the part that's kind of put into the game, to arrive at a border. And so sometimes the border is the major part of the gameplay. So we give some examples there. But once again, none of these take the approach about integration. And once again, refugees tend to be seen as a burden. Maybe a good thing that you do it, like maybe it's, in these games tend to be, these are, I mean, there's not games that are made to say bad things about refugees. So they see refugees in positive light, but it's more in a positive light, like you would have sort of pity on them. they're kind of like, they're not opportunities that can be seized to make your society a stronger place. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about a branch of game research about how to bring social messages through games. And I call this Don't Be Preachy, or How to Hide That You're Trying to Do Good. So basically, before I begin this section, I wanted to say a few things about human rationality that I've learned with quite some, which I've learned recently when I started looking into this. And that I really like this quote here. We are feeling beings who think, not thinking beings who feel. And this is very important. So the distinction here is that humans, as far as we can tell, in fact, we really do feel first. I mean, like, we have an emotional reaction to something. And our decision-making process, which we tend to think of as something rational, is actually much more of an emotional decision. Like, we'll make a decision based on our emotions, and then after the fact, we will tend to justify them using our rationality. So we feel something, and then afterwards we're like, why do I feel that? And you try to figure it out. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. And when you're wrong, this can lead to some big problems. If you think you're feeling awful because this person did something wrong to you, whereas in fact, you just slept really poorly last night, and so you don't feel good, you may act really poorly toward this person because you're misinterpreting your own feelings. And this tends to be the way that we think, and it makes things very difficult. So one thing that I find really interesting about this, there's actually a whole argument that done by researchers there, Mercier and Sperber, that in fact, this might be actually an evolutionary advantage, that perhaps we have evolved, our brains have evolved, to convince others of our ideas rather than trying to actually make logical decisions. And this could make some sense. In fact, like, we tend to think of like we have this ability to reason because I think, therefore I am. I analyze the world and I make a good decision. But it could be that, in fact, in an evolutionary point of view, it's more important to try to convince others of our point of view, because if we're all together on something, then we're probably better off overall than it is to be absolutely right about something. Being absolutely right might get you killed, whereas being able to convince other people, even if you're kind of wrong, could save you. So I find this argument very interesting, and actually would make a lot of things clear. Once again, we tend to interpret how we feel, and in the same way, we tend to interpret how we tend to try to then convince others of things once we made up our mind. And these leads to a bunch of biases that I will talk about now, or psychological barriers. So there's these, in general, when we tend to, when we've made up our mind about something, we have these emotional reactions, we make up our mind, we then we tend to see intellectual threats to our mindset, kind of like a physical one, as if people are attacking us. And we tend to treat them in a similar way. Like, we kind of like want to like hold up and protect ourselves from ideas that don't fit with what we think. And there's a bunch of biases corresponding to this. One, probably the best known, is called the confirmation bias. It's basically the idea that if you think something, you will then, and you hear someone saying something similar to what you already believe, it'll tend to confirm what you think, and you probably won't go looking for evidence to disprove it. You'll probably go, oh yeah, okay, that sounds right, makes sense. Whereas if somebody says something you don't believe, then you're like, that's weird, okay, that doesn't fit at all with what I think. You're not going to believe it, so maybe you're going to go, maybe you will look for evidence, but you'll probably look for evidence to try to disprove that it's true, rather than trying to prove that it's right. And you also might just ignore it, say, that sounds weird, I don't think it's true, and just ignore it overall. So this tends to lead us, once we make up our minds, we tend to assimilate more information that confirms what we think and disregard information that we don't. There's another bias called reactance, or sometimes called the backfire effect, which is basically people not wanting others to tell them what to think. If you think that somebody's trying to control you, trying to tell you something is not true, trying to brainwash you, there's this very strong psychological reaction against that. Again, like I said earlier about the intellectual threat, it tends to, like, oh, don't try to tell me what to think. So people feel like they're being manipulated, they really react strongly against it, and that can be an issue where somebody's trying to lead a social message that goes against what people believe already. And finally, to put the cherry on the cake, we have a blind spot around our own biases, meaning that we tend to think that other people are biased, and we can see biases in other people, but we don't tend to see biases in ourselves. Again, we tend to think of ourselves as rational beings, so other people may be biased, but not us. That's why you hear all the time, I'm not racist, because again, we don't think of ourselves that way. One reason we don't want to think of ourselves as biased is because it goes against our self-image. We want to think of ourselves as strong thinkers, independent thinkers, and generally in a socially positive way, which is good, but we don't always act that way. So when we do things that are biased, we will again tend to reinterpret them, reinterpret the way we acted, and because we were in a story that would make it not because we were biased. In other people, it's a lot easier. We don't necessarily have the same emotional commitment to that. It's okay if they're biased. You won't necessarily see it the same way. Great. So, bringing it back to games, there's this. So some researchers at Tilt Factor, which is a really cool game lab up in northeast U.S., has created a whole bunch of really great games and around pro-social messages, and they have come to the conclusion that basically taking a very literal approach to these pro-social messages, like immigration is good, actually backfires. And the reason it backfires is because, once again, of the biases that we have. We will tend to reject it because we don't want people to tell us what they think. We will also tend to not believe it because of the confirmation bias if it goes against what we already think. And finally, often too much pro-social message of any kind can be just too heavy-handed and just kind of feel like it's not fun. That's not really a bias. It's more just kind of like our experience, And as game creators, obviously, we want people to enjoy your games. Otherwise, there's no point doing it. Might as well just write it on a poster. So what the kind of approach that they've come up with, they call a stealth approach, and it basically has three different parts to it: intermixing, obfuscating, and distancing. So I'll just go by one. So intermixing is basically the idea that less is more. So you don't give too much of your pro-social. Don't give too much. I'll just say message. Don't give too much of your message. Mix it in with other things that are not part of your message, and it actually works better. So the test they did for this idea was based on a game called Buffalo, which is really awesome. It's just a really simple card game with two types of cards, and it's about trying to promote. It's trying to promote like positive role models in science and education, in careers of people who come from minority backgrounds. So this is in the U.S. So they have something like one card that's basically kind of like a profile, some kind of trait of the person, usually their background, like Asian American or Jewish or what's another example they have, or in a wheelchair. And then the second type of card is tends to be like a profession or an accomplishment of some kind. So like Nobel Prize. Maybe you get Nobel Prize and wheelchair. Okay, who got a Nobel Prize in a wheelchair? Or Asian American and lawyer. Okay, do I know Asian American lawyers? That's kind of the idea. And basically, everyone sits around the table and they try to guess. They try to come up with somebody in real life, or if they can't, a fictional character who fits those attributes. So when they did tests on this, they started with having pretty much everything being something like that, like some kind of clear like social minority, and then bit by bit they mixed in things that had nothing to do with it, like big teeth or crazy hair, or something like that, or a giant hat, and these are things that had nothing to do with the minority. And in fact, the more they put in the minority, the more they mixed in, the more they watered down their message. In fact, the better it worked. Both people enjoyed it more, but also when they asked people questions, they had a questionnaire after the fact to try to get an idea of how much it changed people's minds. It tends to change people's minds much more when it was mixed in, and there was just a little dose of message with a lot of, I guess I put it non-message stuff or just fun stuff, than when it was strongly message. So that's intermixing. The idea of obfuscating is basically hiding your message altogether. So, for example, for Buffalo, if you go online and you hunt and you try to go buy it on Amazon, they don't mention anywhere that it's a pro-social game. They don't mention that it's about role models. You have to, if you really want to, you can find it. Obviously, I know it. They've written scientific papers on it. If you go to their website and you look at the bottom, they will talk about it. But it's not the way that it's sold. And so clearly the idea here is that if people, and again, they did tests on this, when they told people this is a game that's about role models, blah, 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 people didn't like it nearly as much. And they didn't say the word as much. So in fact, the exact same game, when people thought it was not, no one's trying to force them to think anything, worked better. So this goes back to this idea of reactance. If you think like, oh, I'm going to play a game that's a propaganda piece about blah, 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 you're going to be very wary on your guard. And you're going to notice it, and you're not going to like it. If you think, oh, I'm going to play a really cool game, and there's a little bit of propaganda mixed in, you might not notice it as much, and you're not going to react the same way. The final idea is about distancing. So this one is basically like providing a little bit of emotional distance between yourself, or between the player and the content, the message. Once again, this works because people have this biased blind spot. They don't see themselves as biased. So this is very often done in fiction. You kind of give somebody a fictional space where something happens and allows them to explore it without it being too close to home, where they feel like it would threaten what they've already done or their self-image or something like that. My favorite example for this is really good science fiction. I found like really good science fiction does this well. They tend to take you to a future world or an alien planet or whatever it is, where there's some social problem that's going on, and the way people are reacting is in fact quite similar to the way people do or would react in real life. But because it's in this fictional universe, it allows us to kind of, well, first of all, it's more interesting, but second of all, it allows us to kind of like approach it with a lot more distance and kind of think about it a lot more rationally. Whereas if it's something, once again, about you, if it was about you, about your family, then you would kind of take a lot of distance. You're trying to defend your self-image or the way you feel about your family, your reputation, that kind of stuff. All right, well, I think that's all I have. I hope that was helpful for everybody. Just to sum up, I guess I don't have a very good conclusion. I guess good luck for the game jam. I hope it goes really well. I trust it will. You have some really great people there. And if you want to hear more from me, please don't hesitate. You can. So our website is there, creparis.org/gamelab. And my name is Jesse Himmelstein. That's my email. I'm online mostly on Twitter and Facebook. And please reach out if you have any questions or if you want to collaborate on a project together or just want to show me the games that you come up with. Okay, goodbye.